Hello and welcome to the last lesson of module 2.9. So this is part 8 of 8, and what we're going to be doing is a revision today, okay, of the last 8 classes. So that's chapter 4 from page 111, so 111, up until page 156. Okay, so it's just before interviews. And in this chapter, what we've looked at is we had a close look at radio programming and formatics specifically. So the planning the format and the running order of the show. And this section is hugely beneficial for anyone who wants to work in any content creation space, because that's everything that we did here. We looked at your voice, different ways of using your voice, and what you can do with it. Then we looked at clock creation and formatics. In essence, we looked at structuring an hour of radio, what goes into that hour, and then how to structure a link or a talk break. We looked at worksheets and templates that will help structure and provide the correct kind of discipline with regards to the creation of content. And then we looked at how to prepare for a show and where to find content to fill up the talk breaks. Okay, so to fill up your links, which will then be followed by features and their content. And then most recently, we looked at the interaction with your audience and how to best understand what characters in radio represent and how to create a meaningful one. We looked at the science behind talking to an audience and not at an audience. So where we're standing by now, you should be able to explain the importance of using your voice as an instrument. So what you should know now from the past 7 lectures is you should be able to explain the importance of using the voice as an instrument and caring for your voice as an instrument to maximize its potential. And then you should be able to explain how to utilize clocks. You also did clocks in your first year. And you should be able to look at clocks to ensure that each element is strategically located to enhance the flow and optimize the impact. And then you should be able to describe what needs to be done in order to prepare for a radio show. You should be able to identify and elaborate on elements of a radio show, describe what a feature is and how features are used, develop and execute a character map for a personality, and then evaluate the effectiveness of radio interaction in a given scenario. Okay, so I'm starting with this so that you can start thinking about this in terms of when we do our revision, as this is going to be your homework. So given everything that you've learned, plan to insert the character and personalities into everything that you prepare. So I'm not going to run through absolutely everything that we did. So for instance, the voice, I'm not going to go through all the voice and performance basics again. What we did is we just told you how to use your voice. And we spoke about techniques for improving on-air performance. And those were sitting up or standing up straight when broadcasting, drinking a lot of water, smiling when you're speaking, having confidence and control over your voice, and utilizing pauses. Okay, so if we start by looking at the character and personalities, plan to insert a character or your personality into everything that you prepare, okay? So every character should have a detailed character map that will help align the content with the presenter's character. And here are 5 ways of inserting personality and characterization into the music radio links. Own the music information. There's a whole heap of music-related information readily available about every single artist and song. What you don't want to give the listeners is a history lesson or bore them with irrelevant facts about a song, okay, or an artist. So instead, use the information to add a more interesting link that shows off your personality. So just bring in some interesting elements here. And then the second one is information elements. Research tells us that information about the weather and traffic are still considered important elements on every show. Every station provides this kind of information, but very few stations are doing this well. Most stations merely go through the motions with a stiff and official forecast and a report. Instead, look at personalizing these information elements. This is another way of showing off your personality. Welcome or shake hands with the listener. Read messages from your listeners and welcome them to your show by name. If you need to, create or construct lines or stories. Yes, make them up if you need to, about their lives and about what they're doing today. So make it sound like everyone is listening and it's a party on your station. And then take phone calls. So listener interaction, even if it's repurposed from the previous day or the previous weeks, gives the impression that you're talking to the audience and not at them. You don't have to turn the show over to them, but having a caller can sound charming and interactive. And then lifestyle comments. Find ways to connect to things happening in the community with simple references that acknowledges that you are one of them. Okay, you're part of the listener's circle. A P2 listener. Okay, so build links with the P2 listener in mind. A P2 listener is defined as a listener that considers you to be their second, third, or even fourth choice of a radio station. You are the radio station that they turn to when their favorite radio station has turned them off. So technically, they are sampling your radio station. The goal with this listener is to keep them tuned in and to keep them listening. This can be achieved by preparing and planning a show around them. And we can do this as follows. Firstly, front load every link creatively. You can do this by always branding the show and the station. So by saying the name of the station in every link, or by focusing on the hook. So that first pretty much 8 seconds in order to keep the listener intrigued. Secondly, you can let the audience get to know you. Ask yourself, why would the audience care about me if they don't even know me? You can make them care by making sure they get to know you, by making the imaging and the production of the show talk to the presenter's personality, making sure the imaging tells the story of the show and includes details from the character maps, by providing personal content that provides insights about me and about my emotional triggers, and by making myself vulnerable. So by telling stories about yourself or about your relationships, or your thoughts, your feelings, your emotions, okay? Be relatable, be endearing. And then take callers. Get callers to call you by your name or by to make reference of the show, okay, using the show's name. And then develop story arcs. Make sure stories develop across multiple days. This will ensure that your listeners will come back to your show as you reveal more every day, okay? This gives your P2 listener a reason to keep listening to you. And then tease. Keep the listener listening for longer. For example, another 15 minutes, and then get them to come back to your show tomorrow by teasing the content effectively. And lastly, they're always contextualize. Make sure that you provide proper context, not only within a link, but also by taking into consideration the environment in which the show is being broadcast. And here, to do this, you should be asking yourself, what sort of day is it? What is everyone in town talking about? What is today's big news story? What big event is coming up? What sports stories are the listeners following? What film or television shows do they want to see? So once you've considered all of the previous points and the content has been created, it's time to put the content into a running order. Different presenters enjoy different types of running orders. This is just a basic template, okay, that you can use. So name of show, date of show, your important numbers, which are the studio telephone number, WhatsApp number, studio SMS line, your website address, things to remember that's coming up in the show or happening in the show. Do you have competitions? What competitions do you have in the show? And then from there, you'll see there's a breakdown per hour. An average show clock will have 5 links per hour, leading us to 15 links, okay? This one has 7, but that includes the news here as the first. So for all of these, you only get 2 types of links. Remember that, the promise or a performance. A promise is me promising you that you need to stay tuned in because I will be giving you something of value, something that I will be making it worth your while. And then the performance is me now living up to my promise, okay? So me now giving you the information that I promised you will be coming up, something that's got an emotive moment attached to it. Okay, so here are your links. So you will put in all your information regarding your links in here, and if there's audio pieces involved. So that's hour 1 and 2, and then there's an hour 3, obviously. And this is just another example of a running order. This one is a little bit more in detail, so it shows you how much live time you will be talking. So this is your actual linking time here, and then the pre-recorded time per section. And here again, if it's live or pre-recorded, so that's pre-recorded, live, 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 pre-recorded, live, pre-recorded, okay? And then just who does it and what's your finish time. Then something that's really important that we looked at is the 5 rules of storytelling. So once a presenter has decided about their one thought, so once a presenter has decided on what their one thought is going to be for the Mexican on the bicycle, they have to prepare and curate the content. Do you remember the man on the Mexican bicycle? It's your obligation, one thought, obligation. Okay, and that obligation could be the name of the show, your name, the station's name, back announcing a song, and then the same on the other side again, okay? So the best way to start preparing your content piece is by utilizing the 5 rules of storytelling. This comes down to that every great story can usually be broken up into 5 different parts: the hook, the crumbs, the dress up, the payoff, and the blackout. So the hook is the most important part of the link. This is the moment where you will grab the listener's attention and get them hooked on the content. It's also called a tease or a throw forward. And you have around 8 seconds to grab the listener's attention here and then to get into a link due to people's shrinking attention spans. The first one here would be then ask your listener something. A question directed at a listener brings them into the conversation immediately. Done correctly, a question can spark a sense of curiosity, and the listener can become involved in the conversation almost immediately. So an example here would be, when is it not appropriate to laugh at someone who fell? Okay, and then the second one would be setting up conflict immediately. Every great story requires conflict. Conflict is that secret spice that makes a great link. By immediately pointing to the conflict in the link, the listener is transported into the middle of a situation in which they are intrigued to see the outcome. It makes the listener wonder about what's coming next. And then make strong declarations or statements or pronouncements or affirmations. Great radio is emotive radio. A technique that helps to create emotive radio is to make a bold or a strong statement that creates an emotional trigger for the audience. Whether they disagree or agree with you or with a statement doesn't matter, as long as they feel strongly about it. So the idea is that the statements should be opinion-based. They give the listener something to react to, and it's always more powerful than a fact-based statement. By triggering an emotional reaction, you immediately involve the listeners in the link. And then make them curious. Humans are naturally inquisitive. It's just the way that we are. So once you trigger mystery and intrigue in the hook, you will be able to keep the listener interested in the link. A presenter will need to give a small part away, but not too much. Set up an expectation that a strong payoff is about to present itself and that it's going to be worth the listener's while. So the body of the link is referred to as the crumbs, similar to Hansel and Gretel's breadcrumbs, so that they could find their way home. A presenter must keep dropping mini payoffs. So that is little twists and turns in the link or the story to keep the listener engaged and intrigued until the very end. Essentially, the aim of the crumbs is to set the story up and to establish something that pays off later. Every link has to have forward momentum that leads as a path or crumbs towards the payoff. No matter how good the hook or even the punchline or the payoff at the end of the link, if the setup or body of the link does not move the story forward, the listener will move on to something else that will attract their attention. This forward momentum has got nothing to do with keeping a link short, talking faster, or even playing high energy music. Instead, it's about keeping the listener engaged by staying focused. You should be dropping crumbs every 7 to 14 seconds. And these are those mini payoffs, changing in direction, twists and turns in the story that move the story forward and keep the listener interested throughout a strategy of planting ideas that will be resolved in the payoff later on. The main reason why listeners will lose interest in the links or the stories in this phase is if you're trying too hard to make the listener laugh. So as a rule of thumb, look for one punchline or payoff for every link. If a presenter can get 2 laughs in every link, that's better. Oh, well, that's even better. The chances, however, of a third big laugh moment happening are very slim, and looking for it in the link usually feels forced, may annoy the listener and make them tune out. And then too many phone calls or notes. Listener interaction on the phone or through voice notes is a really important part of most shows and adds character to a show. However, you should generally aim to take no more than 3 pieces of interaction in every link, especially in personality-based music radio shows. If one piece is brilliant and keeps the listener wanting more, then take or play one piece. If all 3 are great stories that have different angles, have strong hooks, payoffs, and add to the entertainment value of the link, then you can take 3 pieces, but very rarely take more than that. Always structure your listener interaction in every link using your second strongest piece first, whereupon you can move to your weakest of the 3 and then end with your strongest listener interaction. A good idea is then to end the link completely after your last interaction. The rule of thumb is when the listener says goodbye, the link is over. Sticking to this usually forces a presenter to end on a high and leave a link at its peak. Talk radio is slightly different. Here, presenters and producers should always be concerned with the value of every interaction. The call screener or producer should always ask, will this caller add to the rhetoric? Will they introduce a point that moves the story forward without derailing the conversation? Will they add to the overall entertainment of the link? If the answer is yes to all 3, the caller should be allowed on air. Okay, here are 4 tips that can help a presenter master the dropping of clever crumbs. Firstly, get the listener's buy-in. If a presenter can get the listener to agree with them within the first few seconds of the body of the link, then the presenter is on their way to keeping the listener engaged. This means a presenter needs to know their listeners. By knowing who you are, knowing your interests, and having a meaningful data set about you, so about your facts and things. Radio presenters should keep it short, sharp, and simple. A presenter must always remember that listeners are engaged in other action when they're listening to radio. So they're almost listening with half an ear. This means that it's essential to keep your narrative simple, short, and easy to follow, which will always help keep the listener engaged. And then paint a picture and use emotive language. A presenter should always try to engage a listener's imagination. Using emotive language helps to build the story and create a picture in the listener's mind. Phrases like imagine this, take a moment to picture this, can you imagine if, remember when, or think about it are just a few examples of phrases that can help engage a listener's imagination. And then speak only in the active voice, never the passive. This is not an easy skill to master, and it takes a lot of discipline. Likeable presenters use the active voice more often because it's engaging and personable. Active voice sentences will always flow more smoothly and are easier for the listener to follow than passive voice sentences. Passive voice sentences make the listener work harder to understand the sentence than the active alternative. Okay, so stick to the active voice, never the passive. Once you've mastered and executed this, the crumbs, you will have set the listener up to anticipate the resolution or the payoff or the punchline. This is the final part of the link, and it compromises the moment, and it shows the moment in which the presenter rewards the listener and resolves the earlier setup, tells their joke, or throws an unexpected twist in the story. The payoff is really the reward that the listener gets for having listened to the story or the link. To construct a payoff, always ask yourself what you want the listener to remember from this link. This will also help define the payoff for links that are simply utility-based. For example, a news story, details surrounding the traffic, or a weather forecast. Defining the crux, the climax, is the most important. Leave behind will allow you to construct and set up the payoff effectively. Another tool that can help plan and execute a link is called the execution rule of 4. And it states following the following template. So firstly, the teaser, presenting the characters and the obstacle. Secondly, the trouble, presenting a conflict or allowing for a desire to arise. Thirdly, the muddle, where the initial strategy leads to a new obstacle. Then the triumph or the failure, so the moment in which the strategy is either successful or unsuccessful. And then the kicker, the ending in which the changes took place as a result are depicted. When you start preparing for links, start with the following questions. What is the payoff for the listener? Okay, how can we write it in order to engage listeners within 8 seconds? What are our views on the topic? What can we do to add more layers in? And then from here we move to features. Features can also be called benchmarks. They can be broadly described as content pieces that happen at the same time on a daily or a weekly basis. Features have 2 main purposes: to create a mini brand within a show that can easily be recognized and with which the audience will become familiar, or to create a tune-in moment in which listeners add the feature to their list of daily appointments. This creates a pattern of repeat listening, which drives time spent listening and ratings. So here you won't necessarily continue listening to the show, but you will always tune in for the specific feature. And on the other show, or on the mini brand one, you will hear a show name and you will immediately know that this specific feature will be within the show. Listeners want to be entertained, and the feature, if it's entertaining, will create a mini brand and will get listeners coming back daily to listen. According to Tracy Johnson, these are the attributes of a successful feature. It needs to be fun to do and to listen to. It needs to have longevity and be sustainable. It needs to be a good fit for the presenter or the team. It needs to have longevity and be sustainable. Ensure that you have enough ideas, in essence, to draw from. So otherwise, listeners won't come back, okay? Don't launch a completely new feature unless you are confident that it will stay popular over time. And then it needs to be a good fit for the presenter or the team. The execution of the feature must be unique to the presenter. No one else must be able to do it like you can do it. And then lastly, there needs to be a demand for the feature, which means that they should be good enough to be on air every day at the same time so listeners know when to tune in. If a feature can fulfill all of these, okay, all these criteria, then the feature is probably going to work for a show. Look for a game or informational or funny content pieces that are based largely in storytelling. There are many well-known features that fall into these categories, And they can be used by shows or presenters to entertain listeners and to keep them coming back. For this reason, it's also important that they are scheduled regularly. Listeners might tune in to hear the feature, and if it's late or it has been moved to another time slot, listeners may be disappointed and may not tune in again. Be careful of not having too many features on a show. Too many features that are broadcast at the same time on a daily or a weekly basis may become predictable or dull. Okay? Original content gives your show the element of drama and surprise. Top-rated shows have a balance of consistency and predictability and unpredictability. World. Find out what's going on in the lives of the cast of your show. Personal stories that will relate to listeners could work well. Then create a clash of context by putting a character in a situation where they don't belong, and then exaggerate this situation for comedic effect. So, for example, a character with a fear of heights will go skydiving, and then we will use this story to include the listener and create a story arc that acts as a short-term feature. There are multiple opportunities for interesting stories and features. So some of these story. Introduce a new interactive game. Include audio in most of the content segments. Book a guest who's relevant to the audience or show. Book an expert to shed light on an issue. So, for example, personality experts. And create a viral video. And then with regards to interactions, the reality of any audio product is the reality of any audio product is that it's only valuable when listeners are engaged with the content. In other words, if listeners are actually listening and are interacting and concentrating on the product. This is difficult to accomplish for any audio content editor because almost all content products occur while people are doing something else. Okay, so they're listening with half an ear. In order to optimally achieve this, the presenter needs to stand out. They need to be memorable all the time, and they need to create a radio personality that can keep listeners engaged and actively participating in the audio product. They need to create a brand personality. If you ask yourself the following question, if you disappeared from radio forever, would anyone care besides your mother? And you can't answer it immediately, it means you have to work on creating your brand personality. That the listeners will care about. And there are 6 rules for creating a good on-air personality. And you need to develop this before you start creating your fit with the station and other presenters. You need to be memorable. And how do we become memorable? By being interesting. Being interesting makes a personality memorable. You need to be likable. Likability is the most important part of the personality. So find traits in yourself that your audience will like. And then be 3-dimensional. Have layers. Be like an onion, okay? Have personality layers that will be revealed over time. Lastly, quirks are very powerful on air. These often include personality flaws, but ones that are fun. These are often the aspects of your personality that people will tease you for, like a tendency to eat too much chips in my case. The 5 steps for creating good on-air personality. For creating a good on-air personality is, firstly, gather information. And this is information about yourself. Who was I? What is the story of my life? So What is the story of my life? What are my personal quirks? So that all forms part of your gathering your information. And then step 2 is to organize the traits. These include your positive traits, your negative traits, and all quirks, okay? And then the third step is your character synopsis. So here you're going to take all of the lists that you previously had, and you're going to identify your core personality traits. And then step 4 is a 3-word summary. So you're going to reduce the essence of the character to just a few words. And this is now your 3 most prominent character traits. And then step 5, you're going to document it. So you're going to put all of these aspects that you have investigated about yourself on a 1-page, easy to reference character map. Then we looked at the SPIN method, which Chris Jordan came up with quite a few years back, which comprises of the S for self, so being true to yourself, not trying to be another presenter who already exists on air, okay? Just sticking to your own personality. And speaking of personality, actually having one, okay? Because without a personality, it doesn't matter how beautiful your voice is, you're not going to last on radio. So your personality needs to be able to evoke an emotional response in listeners. And then the I, so being personally invested, or at least sounding like you are completely invested in the content that you are delivering. Because if you don't believe in what you're saying, no one else will either. And then the N stands for natural. So being organic, being the same person in studio as you will be on the street, okay? And then before performing anything on air, start by constructing your character's point of view. So how do you feel about the piece emotionally? What is your inner dialogue saying? Do you have a personal story about the piece? And do you have any opinions about the piece or content? Being yourself is the most powerful weapon. Being yourself is your most powerful weapon. Before you develop a radio show or a podcast, you need to do a full audit on your character by asking the following. What is your status and life stage? What do you stand for? What do you enjoy? What frustrates you? What words would you use to describe yourself? If a radio presenter can try to embody, understand, and project their truthful and somewhat exaggerated character, they will genuinely connect with listeners in an authentic and real way. Doing this means that you can create real connections and meaningful interactions with your listener, which is exactly what you want at the end of the day. Okay, and then this is just, again, remembering that you as the presenter need to speak with the listener and not with your co-presenter, even though it can sometimes be useful. However, the majority of the conversations will be directed towards the listener. So the presenter and co-presenter will speak with the listener, and the presenter and caller will speak with the listener, except for a few cases where the presenter can speak directly with the caller. And that brings us to the end of the summary. What you need to do for me for homework, taking into consideration everything from the last 7 lectures, taking into consideration everything from the last 7 lectures, you need to identify and analyze 3 different radio personalities using the following criteria. So their name, station, are they local or international? Which show do they host? How many Twitter followers do they have? Do they have a Facebook fan page? If so, take 3 screenshots of interactions with fans on the page. Identify and screenshot one of their Instagram posts that tells you more about their personality. Watch a YouTube video of them online and write a short summary of how the video displayed their personality. And then lastly, list 3 characteristics that you think sum up their personality. Okay, so that's what you're going to do for me for homework. The reason being, I need to see that you can go and find these characteristics, these personality traits of these presenters, okay, of these radio personalities. And then we'll discuss those. But for now, that brings me to the end of this class, which means that brings us to the end of this module. Okay, so in the next class, we'll be starting with something brand new. So remember to go and listen to radio and to get those 3 presenters, okay, because I want those details from you. And with that, I say goodbye for now. Until next time. Bye.